In 1917, the women shown here dressed in white, holding the Red Cross sign, were parading on Post Road in support of World War I. They also belonged to the Scarsdale Suffrage Club and were campaigning for the November election, which finally granted women the right to vote in New York State. Although many of the Western states had won suffrage, New York was the first Eastern state to pass an amendment to the New York State Constitution to grant women full suffrage. It would take another 3 years of hard work by suffragists before the 19th Amendment was added to our Constitution in 1920. The amendment granted most women the right to vote, but discriminatory laws in some states continued to disenfranchise large groups of men and women. In 1913, when a few women in Scarsdale began advocating for the vote, Scarsdale was only a small residential town with a population of under 3,000 people. It had not yet been incorporated as a village. Many of the large estates and farms were being subdivided into residential neighborhoods. Country life, impressive new houses, leisure clubs, and new schools were attracting more homeowners. It was a ripe time for women in Scarsdale to want a stronger voice in shaping their lives and communities.
These were growing communities, and during this time, this was the key time for Westchester becoming one of the premier suburban areas in the country, one of the most fashionable places outside of Manhattan. So what the women were doing in Westchester reflected upon what women were going to do across the country. The women here had more resources. They were financially more equipped. Many of them had education, perhaps going to boarding school and some even to college, with the resources that, yes, were probably the result of their husband's work or inheritance. They had the time and the ability to put their efforts into a greater realm.
Since the early 1900s, towns in Westchester, especially Bronxville, Yonkers, and White Plains, had formed women's clubs and were active in local events, including the large parade held in New York City in 1910 that was widely reported in the newspapers. However, it wasn't until Florence Bethel arrived in town that a few women in Scarsdale began campaigning for the vote. Florence Hartstuff Bethel was born in Nebraska in 1873 and moved to Scarsdale from Manhattan in 1911 with her husband Frank and their 2 children. They lived in houses on Heathcote Road and what is now Bethel Road, but strangely, the second L in the spelling of their name was left off. Frank Bethel was an executive with the New York Telephone Company. He was Scarsdale's first mayor after the town became incorporated as a village in 1915, and he's credited with designing the first Scarsdale seal. The earliest reported suffrage event that inspired Bethel and her friends took place at the town hall in January 1913. One of the featured speakers was writer Max Eastman, a founding member of New York's Men's Equal Suffrage Club. Also speaking was the remarkable Henrietta Wells Livermore. She worked with the National American Women's Suffrage Association to form training schools to teach women effective ways to advocate for their rights. Florence Bethel and her friends were trained through the National Party and eventually held their own classes in the Tudor-style office near the train station. Few women were accustomed to standing on soapboxes, public speaking, or advocacy of any kind, so these schools were crucial and very successful. 1913 was a pivotal year for the movement. Suffrage activists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized an elaborate parade in Washington, D.C. On March 3rd, 5,000 women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue on the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. Women from countries where they could vote held the first part of the procession, and they were followed by workers, professionals, government officials, and women from all over the country. But as the marches proceeded, members of the crowd turned ugly, some jeering and shoving the women. Hundreds of women were hospitalized. The parade drew national attention to the suffrage movement. The public was appalled by the mistreatment of women by the crowd and the indifference of the police. Within a month, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was reintroduced into both houses for the first time in 23 years. In May, New York hosted a huge parade down Fifth Avenue to demand votes for women. It was during the tumultuous days in 1913 that about a dozen women started meeting at each other's houses and here at Wayside Cottage. They decided to form the Scarsdale branch of the Equal Suffrage Club, and they began campaigning for the November 1915 referendum that would give women the right to vote in New York State. Florence Bethel was elected president. Some of the founding members were Mrs. Willard Winslow, also called Josephine Valentine Winslow, Mrs. C.W. Montgomery, and her cousin Laura Crane Burgess. Many of the young women from the Crane and Burgess families also joined the suffrage club. The stated purpose of their constitution read, "The object of this club shall be to further the interests of women's suffrage and its extension in Scarsdale and the New York area." In 1914, the cottage was a popular tea house owned by Emily Ogden Butler. She was one of Scarsdale's largest landowners, and she was a key benefactor of the suffrage club. Emily had inherited the cottage from her father, Charles Butler. He was a wealthy businessman and, like his daughter, was a progressive philanthropist. They owned a large estate that became the neighborhood of Fox Meadow. Charles Butler purchased the old Dutch farmhouse in 1853. The original section of the cottage dates to the late 1600s. Among the first courageous women to work here was Rose Hetty. She and her 7 children were enslaved by the farmer Thomas Haddon. He freed the family in his will in 1761. In 2024, memorials to honor the family were placed in the garden outside Wayside Cottage by the Witness Stones Project and the Junior League of Central Westchester. The old farmhouse was poorly heated, and the suffragists often worked around the clock, covered in blankets and huddled around the fireplace. Winning support from the undecided voters in Scarsdale was not an easy task. The anti-suffrage movement was strong, and nearly half of the men and women in Scarsdale were either indifferent or against women voting. At the Scarsdale Public Library, we were shown the club's original minutes, recently found by librarian Dan Glauber.
Her handwriting is so neat.
It is so neat. It's incredible to see their real handwriting, and here's the Constitution in this tiny booklet. This page read, "The business of this meeting is as follows. First, appoint a canvassing committee. Second, arrange a big town suffrage meeting. Third, collect money for a campaign fund." For months before the November election, the women were busy organizing events, publishing leaflets, and canvassing the village. A motor car was sent out weekly from Scarsdale to tour Rockland County. Westchester Life magazine reported that 20,000 women had been enrolled in assembly and district organizations, and that 102 local suffrage clubs had been formed in Westchester. To confront the anti-suffragist propaganda and conservative views about women, the club held fashionable events with well-regarded experts. At the popular Heathcote Inn on Popham Road, Professor Harry Overstreet spoke on the evolution of the sexes and their equality.
One of the advantages that the Scarsdale Equal Suffrage Club had was that they were able to gather a lot of very prominent men and women in the society at the time. They had high tea fundraisers, they had fundraisers at golf clubs. There were a lot of letters written into the Scarsdale Inquirer in 1915 and 1917 by men showing their support for the suffrage movement. Rush Wilson, one of the primary builders of downtown Scarsdale, replied, "In my judgment, women should have a voice in governmental affairs same as men, not as a privilege, but as a right." Professor Thomas Harrington echoed a common argument when he wrote, "A large share of the burden of taxation is borne by the women of this state today. Shall we refuse to grant them, in this enlightened age, the sum and substance of that for which our forefathers fought and died?"
Whatever was the social realm, whether it was a quilting bee or a fancy tea party or a church gathering, this is where women would come together, and this is how they could exchange ideas and how they could strategize how they were going to move forward. And fortunately, these tea parties often included guest speakers. and the guest speakers were the ones that would bring in the news from the rest of the country and put forth their opinions on how things should go to get women behind them.
In October, the club had registered 60 people to march in a massive parade that was held in New York City before the November referendum. Scarsdale men were also encouraged to march with the Men's Equal Suffrage League. They rallied at the public school the morning of the parade and heard speeches by city officials, including Robert Adamson, the New York Fire Commissioner. The club decided to wear white felt hats, which were sold for 50 cents, and blue banners were given out to the women who signed up early. 40,000 women marched down Fifth Avenue in New York City that day. Despite the tremendous efforts of the suffragists, the amendment in New York State was rejected by 58% of the voters. The New York Times editorial stated, "The men of the mighty industrial states voted it down for the good of the state and good of women. The essential American conservatism, the old-fashioned notion of the position and duties of women prevailed." In Westchester, the suffragists lost by nearly 5,000 votes, with about 24,000 men voting against the amendment and 19,000 men favoring the change. Undeterred by the devastating news, Florence became even more determined, and she immediately hung a sign outside Wayside Cottage announcing that victory was postponed and a meeting would be held next week. The club began a new and final chapter. Bethel opened offices in Mount Vernon and became the leader of the 2nd Assembly District. She traveled widely and addressed audiences throughout the state. In November 1916, an important suffrage convention was held in Albany. A few club members motored to the Capitol for the 3-day event to prepare for the 1917 vote. The club's business expert, Josephine Winslow, spoke about finance, and they all dressed up to attend a ball at the governor's home. Under the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, the strategy of the suffrage movement would change significantly, and Scarsdale women would become more involved in civic affairs. Catt was a veteran leader of the suffrage movement. Her skillful organization abilities and eloquent speeches had caught the attention of the aging Susan B. Anthony, who she succeeded as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1900.
She was the one who strategized the breakdown of the states and the importance of winning each of the states over to get the momentum to finally get President Wilson to sign for the ratification. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she and her longtime friend and partner, also a suffragist, would live in Newcastle at Juniper Ledge. And she was still very involved with this temperance movement, and it was said she didn't want to stay living there because the juniper berries were used to make gin. But there are other reasons. It was a little too rural for them. So she bought a home in New Rochelle, just up the hill from where Thomas Paine's cottage was. And here in this house, she continued to live until her death and continued to work on causes that were important to her. Women for Peace and Disarmament, the League of Women Voters.
Catt had founded the Women's Peace Party with Jane Addams. But when America entered the war in April 1917, she compromised her views and pledged the NAWSA's support for the war effort. While Catt lobbied Washington to win President Wilson's support for the federal amendment, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns' party continued to oppose the war, and they shocked the nation by picketing outside the White House. The Scarsdale women followed Carrie Chapman's less radical path, and they passed a resolution against the picketers who they felt were unpatriotic and damaging to the cause. However, the determination of the picketers eventually became an advantage. The public responded with sympathy and indignation when the suffragists were repeatedly arrested, actions that the Supreme Court later ruled was illegal. While imprisoned, they were beaten, treated harshly, and force-fed a mixture of egg and milk during their hunger strikes. The constant publicity kept the suffrage movement in the public eye throughout the war years, and scholars credit both Catt's and Paul's strategies with pressuring President Wilson to support the federal amendment. As America entered World War I in 1917, both anti- and pro-suffrage women in Scarsdale worked together to support the war effort. Under the leadership of Scarsdale suffragist Josephine Valentine Winslow, women went door to door throughout the county conducting a military census which surveyed all able-bodied males over the age of 16. Women sold war liberty bonds and melted down their jewelry to raise funds. Nurses and medical workers were in high demand, not only for the war, but also to combat the deadly influenza epidemic spreading at home and across Europe. Mrs. Frank Blumenstock, who owned a sign-making store in Scarsdale, became a lieutenant in the Red Cross Women's Motor Ambulance Corps, and she drove influenza and polio patients to the New York hospitals during the 1918 epidemic. When food supplies were threatened by the war, the Suffrage Club launched a cooperative farming project called the Community Farm. Emily Butler donated over 30 acres of her Fox Meadow estate to the farms. So just to give a sense of where the farm was, we're coming around the side of Wayside Cottage and actually walking toward where the high school now is. So if you can imagine, this was 30 acres of open farmland. And of course, the school was much smaller as it was being built around this time. Women and men, Boy Scouts, and school children were organized for agricultural work, and all of the land around and behind Wayside was planted with a wide variety of vegetables, including potatoes, carrots, beets, cabbage, beans, turnips, tomatoes, and sweet corn. What they couldn't sell, they brought by cars to New York City for distribution. The community farms were so successful that some of the leaders were invited to the White House. The farms received national attention and became a model for similar projects across the country. The Farms House Committee was headed by Josephine Valentine Winslow and Laura Crane Burgess. Both women belonged to old Scarsdale families. Laura's father, Colonel Alexander Crane, was Emily Butler's attorney. He was a Civil War hero and owned a large estate that became the Crane-Berkeley neighborhood of Scarsdale. Laura was married to Thomas Burgess, a founding member of the Town Club, and they owned a large house on the road that now, of course, is called Burgess Road. Another active suffragist during the war was Edna Morse Walker Jackson, also known as Mona. She hosted numerous events and suffrage dances at her large estate on Old Army Road. She was a close friend of Florence Bethel's, and the families often vacationed together. A mother of 5 daughters and a talented photographer, she was a part of a group of Scarsdale artists who donated their work to raise funds for the Red Cross. Her first husband, Roberts Walker, was an advocate for women's rights and served as a legal advisor to the Women's Club. He was a powerful railroad attorney who also investigated Native American land claims on behalf of his longtime school friend, President Calvin Coolidge. When Roberts passed away unexpectedly in 1926, Coolidge sent a sympathy telegram to Edna, which her descendants shared with us along with a collection of many treasured photographs. In October of 1917, Scarsdale women joined in the enormous parade in New York City, which emphasized women's patriotism and contributions to the war effort. Carrie Chapman Catt led the parade, joined by thousands of other women, including Red Cross nurses, military census takers, factory workers, and the wives and mothers of servicemen. The signatures of over 1 million women were collected by suffragists and displayed on boards they carried down Fifth Avenue. Mabel Pinghua Lee, who had organized one of the first New York City marches in 1913, led a party of Chinese Americans from Chinatown. Civil rights activist and journalist Ida B. Wells also joined the parade. 2 months earlier, in May 1917, Wells had participated in the silent parade in New York City to advocate for anti-lynching laws and protest the murder of 39 men in Illinois. There were long-standing divisions within the movement between white and black suffragists dating back to the Civil War. Wells had protested the segregation of black women in the 1913 Washington Parade and refused to march at the back of the line.
This big board was used in the suffrage rallies. You can see the holder here. There was one on each side. Women could carry them in the parades to show all of the support they had gathered from people in Westchester County. These were found in the former Mason building in Ossining. We have 5 of them, and these names reflect people from all parts of the county. We actually have transcribed all of these by community so that you can see who from your community had signed. They weren't going by their own names yet.
And were you in a parade once with for
Oh,
women's
lots
suffrage?
of times.
Really?
I was in all of them. Of course, we had things thrown at us.
Imagine. What kind of things did they throw at you?
Tomatoes and things of that sort. Fortunately, they didn't throw it at your face.
Your clothes.
Your clothes. Sent them to the cleaner a lot. They were sort of tough youngsters.
Things they would yell at you, I suppose, were pretty bad.
Well, we'll skip over that part of it.
But you never said anything back?
No.
You just never said anything?
Looked straight ahead. That's what
I
they told us
see.
to do.
Yes.
Keep right on marching.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the only time that you worried a little was if they got you when you had a halt. Now, that could last about 5 minutes, sometimes a little longer.
They had to have the vote. They had to have the vote. And that was crystal clear. And it was really clear after World War I. And they could see that they were no longer going to be able to sit back and let their lives be dictated by men without them having any say whatsoever.
The patriotic work of women during the war earned them widespread respect and the needed support to win the vote. On November 6, 1917, the New York State suffrage amendment was passed by a majority of approximately 94,000 votes. Over 703,000 men voted yes, and more than 600,000 voted no. In Westchester County, the suffragists won by more than 7,000 votes, with over 24,000 in favor and almost 17,000 opposed. In Scarsdale, the suffrage measure passed by a margin of 92 votes. In District 1, it was carried by only 13 votes, while District 2 showed a stronger result, with 138 men voting yes and 53 voting no. However, the fight was far from over. It wasn't until June 4, 1919, that both houses passed the federal amendment. In order for it to become law, it had to be ratified by 36 states. It was a difficult battle against racial, political, and social constraints, especially in the southern states where politicians wanted to further restrict the black vote. Tennessee was the 36th state to finally ratify the amendment. On August 26, 1920, the amendment was signed into law and 26 million women had finally won the right to vote. Alice Paul sewed the final star on her banner, which represented the 36th state that ratified the amendment. Upon hearing the news that Tennessee had approved the amendment, Scarsdale women hurried to the newsstands. The Enquirer reported, "Not satisfied with the early afternoon edition that reached Scarsdale, they rushed on local trains to New York, and they bought out newsstands at Grand Central Station."
You know, you must remember the first time you voted.
Oh.
What was it like?
It was the biggest thrill of my life.
Oh, yeah.
It was the very biggest thrill of my
Just
life.
imagine.
Well, she had a tea. Mrs. Cat had a tea
Oh?
for a lot of us.
Mm.
She asked me if I had any children, and I said yes, I had two. She said, well, you must bring them to tea sometime. And I thought, well, she's just talking. About 2 weeks later, her secretary called me, and Mrs. Cat wants to know whether it would be convenient for you to have tea with her next Thursday. I don't know how I sat on that chair, because to me, of course, she was the embodiment of everything I held dear. She had such courage.
The Scarsdale Suffrage Club decided to reorganize after New York won the state vote, and they formed the Scarsdale Women's Club in 1918. Margaret Atwood was elected the first president, and the membership opened its doors to women who had opposed suffrage as well. In order to provide an official office for the club, Emily Butler deeded the cottage to the village. She had very specific conditions for its use, which included allowing the women's club to use the cottage rent-free for as long as they needed it. Today, the Junior League of Central Westchester enjoys some of these same privileges. So this is where we have the offices for the Junior League. And you can see we have storage up here. Here's a picture of when this was used as a bedroom. And if you look behind us, it's the same view, the same perspective with the window. And I guess there was a fireplace under there. My most favorite part is this closet over here where we have the archives. So we've been going through this closet, which holds all the archives for the Junior League, and we pulled out one of the binders. And the first thing we saw when we opened it was a copy of the deed. So we like to think maybe Emily was sending us a message. And it very clearly states that the leasee agrees to use the premises for one of the following: promoting the welfare of the village of Scarsdale, fostering a general public and democratic spirit in the community, conducting a center for the civic welfare of the village, maintaining a clubhouse, clubrooms, or lyceum for the use of the people of Scarsdale. In 1919, with their new headquarters in place, the Women's Club made a pioneering decision to take over the failing Scarsdale Inquirer. The Inquirer was Scarsdale's only local paper. It was originally printed as a newsletter by the Young Christian Endeavor Society for the Arthur Manor community in Edgewood. Editor Charles Brown and Stephen Angel, who became a prime developer of Scarsdale, expanded and renamed the paper the Scarsdale Inquirer in 1901. It continued to be published as the supplement to the Bronxville Review, owned by William Van Duzer Lawrence. The Lawrence newspaper strongly supported state suffrage for women, and Florence Bethel appreciated their extensive coverage of the movement. When the Scarsdale Inquirer could no longer pay its bills, the Review sold the paper to the Women's Club for $1 along with a year-long printing contract. Bethel made it clear that it would not be a paper for women's propaganda, but one for the whole community without allegiance to any political party. The hard work of winning the vote and enduring the war years had given the suffrage club members the skills and confidence to manage almost any project, including printing a highly successful newspaper.
It was a natural for the Women's Club to take over this failing newspaper. They were intelligent, educated, interested in the community, and so it was a kind of a philanthropic thing because initially no one was paid. I think it was around 1923 they hired an editor who was a member of the club but had professional experience. But the rest of the time the women were doing everything. They were selling ads, they were keeping the books, they were writing, they were editing, and it was a community effort.
The Scarsdale Inquirer had offices at Wayside and several locations, including the Harwood Building. In 1934, the Scarsdale Improvement Company erected this building on Scarsdale Avenue to house the Printerwick Company. They published a glossy coated version of the Inquirer, which won prizes for the best typography and printing from the National Editorial Association. Longtime editor Ruth Chalmers joined the newspaper in 1926 and recalled she was first a part-time reporter, chief cook, and baby bottle washer.
Ruth Chalmers, who was editor even longer than I was well known. You know, she was tough and she was hardworking and a really good editor. Won a lot of prizes for the newspaper.
What made her so special?
Well, she lived in Scarsdale. She was the wife of the minister at St. James the Last Church. As with many, many women who've worked for the Inquirer, she knew a lot about the community. She had children, she was very plugged into things, she knew people, she was interested, and that's the main reason why the Inquirer has been always staffed by women, partly because they could work part-time locally, they could fit it in with their other schedules and responsibilities, so it was really an ideal job for women.
In 1919, realizing that women had to learn to use the power of their vote, Mrs. Bethel, Mrs. Montgomery, and Mrs. Winslow founded the Scarsdale branch of the League of Women's Voters. The National League had been founded by Carrie Chapman. Their platform included prohibiting child labor, providing aid for mothers and children, offering federal support for women's education, reducing the cost of living and food, and abolishing discrimination against employed and married women. At that time, they were often not accepted or taken seriously. New York Governor Miller declared they were a menace. In addition to civic work, the club founded the Wayside Players, which grew into a popular theater company. Committees for the arts, music, and drama evolved into their own independent associations in Scarsdale. The well-known Impressionist painter, Anna Richard Brewster, taught art classes, and she was a founding member of the Scarsdale Art Association, which now has offices at the Girl Scout House. Anna Richards Brewster painted beautiful scenes of Scarsdale, which she later donated to the Scarsdale Public Library. During World War I, she also designed posters for the Red Cross. In 1926, the Suffrage Club mourned the unexpected loss of Josephine Valentine Winslow, who died of pneumonia. The women had formed close bonds during their challenging work together, and Josephine was deeply admired for her skills and endearing personality.
It really struck me how much care Florence Bethel had for Josephine. When she passed away, she wrote to the Scarsdale Inquirer, "How can we, who feel so deeply, put our thoughts into words? To try to describe her is difficult, and yet all who know her were constantly aware of her fineness, her loveliness. I think perhaps the memory we shall all keep longest is of the joy and happiness she brought to small, dull tasks catalogued as duty by most of us. Sensitive, her sense of humor spared her. Much of all the glory that is ours in Scarsdale is due to her quiet, modest, self-effacing work."
Josephine loved gardening, and when the Women's Club moved into their stately new home on Drake Road, the club planted a grove of crabapple trees in her memory. Between 1919 and 1927, the club grew from 200 members to over 900 members, so it became clear they needed a bigger space to do their work. They decided to purchase the historic Rowsley House. The main section of the house was built in 1853 by William Bailey Lang, a successful iron merchant. He designed his home in the style of a manor house that he admired in Derbyshire, England. Lang also preserved the magnificent ancient oak tree, which is believed to have been sacred to the Siwanoy nation that once lived in this area. The house has been beautifully decorated and renovated over the years in keeping with the original character of the rooms that Lang decorated. There were 2 kitchens, a dumbwaiter, and a dining room, which allowed the women to serve lunches. Nancy Horrigan showed us a closet filled with books of news clippings about the club since 1929.
In this closet is our collection of scrapbooks, which had been kept by the historian for the Scarsdale Women's Club, which has changed over each person over the years. And they are basically clippings from the Scarsdale Inquirer. The motor corps. Yeah. So still during the war. Dress well in Bribon's. And here's Girl Scouts from Chinatown. Girl Scouts were started here. They used the building as a meeting place. They were just very active, intelligent women who wanted to do something with their brains and their skills. They saw needs for children, for elderly, not just those who could afford it, but anybody and with the village that could benefit from it. They were instrumental in starting the ambulance corps. They had English classes for quote-unquote foreigners. They had visiting nurse, free or paid. The Edgemont, I think it's family counseling, that also was kind of born through the Scarsdale Women's Club. So they were always looking for something that would benefit the people of the community. They just had their fingers in all the pies and wanted to work together, not as a separate entity from the men who ran things, but as a team. And that was their goal. And I think in the back of their heads, we're pretty good and equal. So. And this is the Bethel room.
Florence Hartstuff Bethel passed away in 1956 at the age of 83. Even in her later years, she remained dedicated to improving the lives of women and the people of Scarsdale. She actively participated in peace and civic organizations established by her mentor, Carrie Chapman Catt. When the 19th Amendment was finally certified on August 26, 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt delivered a speech whose words resonate just as strongly today as they did then.
Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. No soldier in the great suffrage army has labored and suffered to get a place for you. Their motive has been the hope that women would aim higher than their own selfish ambitions, that they would serve the common good.